David Chen was the kind of man who lived by schedules and spreadsheets. At 34 years old, he was a corporate lawyer who measured success in billable hours and closed cases. His apartment was clean, organized, and empty most of the time because he was always at the office. He ate breakfast at his desk, lunch during conference calls, and dinner while reviewing contracts. His refrigerator held takeout containers and energy drinks. His closet had 7 identical suits. His life was predictable, comfortable, and completely hollow. That Thursday started like every other day. Wake up at 5:30. Gym for 45 minutes. Shower. Suit. Coffee. Office by 7. He had back-to-back meetings until 6 in the evening, and his head was pounding by the time he finally left the building. The sky had turned dark and heavy, and within minutes, rain started pouring down in thick sheets. David didn't have an umbrella. Of course he didn't. He never paid attention to weather forecasts. He spotted a small bookstore across the street and ran toward it, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles. The moment he pushed through the door, a little bell chimed above his head. The store smelled like old paper and coffee. It was warm and quiet, the complete opposite of his sterile office. David shook the water from his hair and looked around. There were maybe 3 other people browsing the shelves, and soft music played from somewhere in the back. He wandered toward the philosophy section, not because he read philosophy, but because it seemed like the kind of thing he should be interested in. His hand reached for a blue book on the top shelf. Something about finding meaning in life. At the exact same moment, another hand reached for the same book. Their fingers touched, and David pulled back quickly. "Sorry," they both said at once. David looked up and saw her. She had warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore scrubs under a rain-soaked jacket. There was something about her presence that felt calm and genuine. She laughed, a real laugh that made David realize he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard someone laugh like that. "You take it," she said, gesturing to the book. "No, you were here first," David replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. "How about we both look at it?" she suggested. "There's a coffee shop in the back. We could sit for a minute, until the rain stops." David should have said no. He had emails to answer, a brief to review, calls to return. But something made him nod. They walked to the small cafe area, ordered coffee, and sat at a corner table with the philosophy book between them. She introduced herself as Amara. She was a hospice nurse, she told him. She spent her days with people in their final months, helping them find comfort and peace. "That must be depressing," David said without thinking. Amara tilted her head, considering his words. "Sometimes it's sad, sure. But mostly it's beautiful. People become really honest at the end. They stop pretending and start saying what actually matters to them. I learn something new every day." David couldn't imagine that kind of work. His job was about winning, about proving points, about being right. He said as much. And Amara listened without judgment. They talked about their completely different worlds. She asked him questions nobody had asked him in years. When was the last time he took a vacation? Did he have hobbies? What made him want to be a lawyer in the first place? David realized he didn't have good answers. He'd wanted to be a lawyer because it seemed impressive, because it paid well, because his parents were proud. But when had he last felt proud of himself? When had he last done something just because it made him happy? 2 hours passed. The rain kept falling outside, creating rivers along the sidewalk. David had missed 4 calls and ignored a dozen texts. But for the first time in years, he didn't care. Amara told him stories about her patients, about a 90-year-old woman who started painting for the first time, about a former teacher who spent his last weeks writing letters to every student he could remember. She talked about her weekend plans to volunteer at a community garden, about the terrible pottery class she was taking just for fun. "You should come," she said suddenly. "To the garden. We always need extra hands." "I don't know anything about plants," David admitted. "Neither did I when I started. That's not really the point." Eventually, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Amara checked her phone and made a small sound of surprise. "I have to go," My shift starts in an hour. She stood up, pulled out her phone, and handed it to David. Put your number in. I'll text you about the garden thing, if you want. David typed in his number, his hands shaking slightly, though he couldn't explain why. Amara smiled at him one more time. That genuine smile that reached her eyes, and left. The bell chimed as she walked out into the damp evening. David sat alone at the table for another 10 minutes, staring at the philosophy book they'd never actually opened. His phone buzzed with work notifications, pulling him back to reality. But something had shifted. As he finally stood to leave, he realized his headache was gone. When Amara's text came through the next morning, David stared at it for a full minute. Garden volunteer day is Sunday, 9 a.m. No pressure, but would be great to see you there. It included an address and a sun emoji. David hadn't been to anything social in months. Years, maybe. His weekends were for catching up on work, for getting ahead on cases, for preparing for Monday. But he found himself replying, "I'll be there." Sunday morning felt strange. David woke up without an alarm, without the immediate urge to check his work email. He put on jeans and an old shirt he'd forgotten he owned. The community garden was in a neighborhood he'd never visited, tucked between apartment buildings and a small park. When he arrived, Amara was already there, wearing overalls and talking to an elderly man about tomato plants. She waved when she saw him, her whole face lighting up. "You came." "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," David admitted. She introduced him to the other volunteers. There was Mrs. Kim, who'd been gardening for 40 years. There was a college student named Raphael, who was studying environmental science. There was a father with his 2 young daughters, teaching them how to pull weeds without disturbing the good plants. Everyone was friendly, easy, relaxed. Nobody asked David what he did for a living or how much money he made. Amara handed him gloves and a small shovel. "We're planting herbs today. I'll show you." They worked side by side in the dirt. David's hands got filthy. His knees hurt from kneeling. But Amara kept talking, telling him about the history of the garden, about how this empty lot had been transformed by neighbors who wanted something beautiful in their community. She asked him about his week, and he found himself being honest about how exhausting it was. How he'd worked until midnight, 3 days in a row. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because there's always more work to do. But will there ever be a day when it's done? When you can finally rest?" David didn't have an answer to that. Over the next few weeks, David saw Amara more and more. Coffee on Tuesday mornings before work. Dinner on Thursday evenings at small restaurants he'd never noticed before. A Sunday afternoon at a museum. Looking at paintings and arguing playfully about which ones were actually good. For the first time since college, David left work at 6 o'clock. His assistant looked shocked. His colleagues made jokes about him having a girlfriend. Amara introduced him to her world gradually, gently. She took him to a community center where she volunteered, teaching art classes to kids. She invited him to a potluck with her friends, where everyone brought homemade food and played board games until midnight. She brought him to visit one of her elderly patients who loved talking about history. And David found himself fascinated by stories about the neighborhood 50 years ago. His own life started changing in small ways. He actually took his lunch breaks, eating in the park instead of at his desk. He called his sister for the first time in months, just to talk. He bought a plant for his apartment, something Amara helped him pick out, and he was surprised by how much he cared about keeping it alive. His senior partner, Mr. Harrison, noticed the changes too. "You've been distracted lately," he said during a case review. "Your work is still good, but your focus seems divided. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," David said. "Actually, everything's better than it's been in years." Mr. Harrison frowned. "This is a critical time in your career, David. Partnership decisions are coming up. I need to know you're committed." The word partnership used to make David's heart race with excitement. Now it just made him tired. But he nodded and promised to refocus. He worked late that night, missing dinner plans with Amara. He texted her an apology. She replied with understanding, but David felt something twist in his chest. The next morning, Saturday, Amara showed up at his apartment with coffee and bagels. They sat on his small balcony, and she asked him directly, "Are you happy?" "What kind of question is that?" David deflected. "A simple one. Are you happy with your life?" David looked at his apartment, at his expensive furniture and empty walls. He thought about his bank account, his impressive job title, his professional reputation. Then he thought about Thursday evenings with Amara, about getting dirt under his fingernails at the garden, about actually laughing until his stomach hurt. "I'm starting to figure out what happiness might look like," he said quietly. "And it's not what I thought it would be." Amara reached across the small table and squeezed his hand. "Good. That's a start." The junior partnership offer came exactly 2 months after David met Amara. Mr. Harrison called him into the corner office with the big windows and the view of the city skyline. The offer letter sat on the mahogany desk. It represented everything David had worked toward for 10 years. More money than he'd ever imagined, his name on the firm letterhead, a corner office of his own. Respect and recognition. There was just one condition. The position was in the New York office. He'd need to relocate within 60 days and commit to even longer hours as he established himself, 90-hour weeks minimum for the first year. High-profile cases, international travel, no room for distractions. "This is what we've been building toward," Mr. Harrison said, smiling. "You've earned this, David. We see big things in your future." David took the offer letter home. He read it 5 times. He called his parents, who screamed with excitement. His father actually cried. His mother started planning a celebration dinner. His college friends sent congratulatory texts. Everyone in his life saw this as the ultimate success. But that same week, Amara invited him to something completely different. One of her patients, an 82-year-old woman named Mrs. Chen, had passed away. The family was holding a memorial service, and they'd invited Amara to attend. She asked if David would come with her for support. "I know it's not exactly a fun Saturday afternoon," Amara said. "But Mrs. Chen was special. She taught me a lot about living fully." David almost said no. He had the partnership offer to consider, research to do about New York neighborhoods, plans to make. But something in Amara's voice made him agree. The memorial service was held in a small community hall. Maybe 50 people attended, most of them elderly, some younger family members. The walls were covered with photographs of Mrs. Chen throughout her life, as a young woman in China, as a new immigrant learning English, opening her small restaurant, at her children's weddings, holding grandchildren, always smiling, always surrounded by people. Person after person stood up to share stories. Mrs. Chen had taught half the neighborhood how to make dumplings. She'd helped new immigrants find jobs and apartments. She'd babysat everyone's children for free because she said kids needed grandmothers. She'd written letters to lonely people and never forgot a birthday. She'd survived poverty and discrimination and loss. But she'd never stopped being kind. An elderly man spoke through tears. "Mrs. Chen used to tell me that we're not remembered for what we owned or what title we had. We're remembered for how we made people feel, for whether we showed up when it mattered." David sat in the back row, listening to 2 hours of stories about a woman who'd made minimum wage most of her life, who'd never been famous or important by society's standards, but the room was packed with people whose lives she'd changed. Children who called her grandmother though they weren't related. Adults who credited her with their success. Friends who loved her deeply. After the service, David stood looking at the photo wall. Amara came up beside him. "She lived in a tiny apartment her whole life," Amara said softly. "Never had much money. But look at this. Look at how many people she touched. That's real wealth." David felt something crack open inside his chest. He thought about his own life. If he died tomorrow, who would come to his funeral? His colleagues would send a nice flower arrangement. His parents and sister would be there. But who would stand up and tell stories about how David had changed their lives? Who would cry because the world felt emptier without him? They left the memorial service and walked through the neighborhood in silence. Finally, David said, "I need to tell you something. My firm offered me junior partnership." Amara stopped walking. "David, that's incredible. That's what you've been working for." "It's in New York. I'd have to move. Work even more hours." He watched her face carefully, looking for disappointment or anger. Instead, she just looked sad. When do you have to decide? 2 weeks. They sat down on a bench in a small park. Kids were playing on swings nearby, their laughter cutting through the evening air. Amara didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she spoke. I can't tell you what to do, David. This has to be your choice. But what do you think I should do? She turned to look at him directly. I think you should choose the life that makes you feel alive. Not the life that looks impressive on paper. Not the life your parents want or your colleagues expect, the one that makes you wake up feeling grateful. And if I don't know which one that is, I think you do know. You're just scared to admit it. David reached for her hand. I don't want to lose you. You won't lose me, Amara said. But you might lose yourself if you keep choosing what you think you should want, instead of what you actually want. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, thinking about Mrs. Chen's memorial service, about all those people whose lives she'd touched. He thought about the elderly client he was representing, helping her protect her assets so she could leave something for her grandchildren. He thought about how satisfying it felt to actually help someone, not just win a case. He picked up his phone and looked at the partnership offer email. Then he looked at a text from Amara. A photo from the community garden. The herbs they'd planted together now growing strong and green. The choice should have been obvious. Partnership meant security, prestige, everything he'd worked for. But somehow, it felt like choosing a prison. For 2 weeks, David existed in a strange state of paralysis. He'd open the partnership offer on his computer, read it again, then close the document without making a decision. Mr. Harrison asked for updates. David said he was thinking it over, considering the logistics of the move. In truth, he was terrified. He avoided Amara's calls, not because he didn't want to talk to her, but because he didn't know what to say. Every conversation felt loaded with the weight of his decision. She texted him gentle messages. Thinking of you. No pressure. Just here if you need to talk. The garden misses you. Each message made his chest ache. His mother called constantly, asking about apartment hunting in New York. His father sent links to moving companies. His colleagues started treating him differently, like he was already something more than them. Everyone seemed to have opinions about his future except David himself. Then his elderly client, Mrs. Rodriguez, passed away. David found out from her grandson, who called to thank him for his work. You were the only lawyer who treated her like a person. Not just a case, the grandson said. She always said you actually listened to her stories. That meant more to her than winning the case. David sat in his office after that call, staring at nothing. Mrs. Rodriguez used to tell him about her life every time they met, her childhood in Puerto Rico, her late husband, her children and grandchildren. David had listened. Truly listened. For the first time in his career. And it had mattered to her. He thought about Mrs. Chen's memorial service, about all those people whose lives had meaning not because of their job titles but because of their connections. He looked around his office at his law degree on the wall, his awards and commendations, his expensive desk. All of it felt hollow. That evening, David finally called Amara. Can I see you? They met at the bookstore where they'd first encountered each other. It felt appropriate somehow, coming full circle. They ordered coffee and sat at the same corner table. Amara didn't ask about the partnership. She just waited for him to talk. I've been avoiding you, David admitted. I know. I didn't want to have to choose between my career and you. Amara reached across the table. David, this isn't about me. This is about you choosing between two versions of your own life. I can't make that choice for you. What if I make the wrong choice? What does wrong even mean? Wrong, by whose standards? David ran his hands through his hair. Everyone expects me to take the partnership. My parents are already planning a celebration. My colleagues think I'd be crazy to turn it down. The money alone. Will the money make you happy? Amara interrupted gently. I don't know. Maybe? Isn't that what success looks like? Is it? She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. It was from last month. At the community center, David was helping a kid with a painting, both of them covered in paint, both laughing. "You look happy here. I've seen you in your suit going to work. You don't look like this." David stared at the photo. He barely recognized himself. When had he last laughed like that at the office? "I'm scared," he admitted. "What if I turn down the partnership and regret it? What if I give up everything I've worked for, and it turns out I made a huge mistake? And what if you take the partnership and wake up in 10 years realizing you've been living someone else's dream?" Amara countered. "There's risk either way, David. But only one path is actually yours." They talked for hours. Amara didn't try to convince him one way or another. She just asked questions. What did he actually enjoy about his work? When did he feel most fulfilled? If money and prestige weren't factors, what would he choose? What would he tell his client, Mrs. Rodriguez, if she were asking him this question? When David finally left the bookstore that night, something had crystallized. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't the easy choice, or the expected choice, but it was his choice. The next morning, David walked into Mr. Harrison's office before he could change his mind. "I appreciate the partnership offer more than I can say, but I'm going to have to decline. And I'm giving my notice. 30 days. Mr. Harrison's face went through several emotions. Shock. Confusion. Anger. "You're making a terrible mistake. Do you have any idea how rare these opportunities are?" "I know exactly how rare they are. But I also know it's not the right opportunity for me." "Is this about a woman?" Mr. Harrison demanded. "No," David said honestly. "This is about me finally figuring out what kind of life I want to live." Calling his parents was harder. His mother cried. His father was silent for a long time, then asked, "Are you sure about this, son?" When David said yes, his father just sighed. The disappointment was clear. But then David drove to the hospice center where Amara worked. He walked in with flowers, his heart pounding. When Amara saw him through the window, she stepped outside. Before she could say anything, David spoke. "I turned down the partnership. I gave my notice. I'm staying here." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "David, wait. Let me finish. I didn't do this for you. I mean, you were part of it. But that's not the main reason. I did it because I finally realized I've been living the life I thought I was supposed to want instead of the life I actually want. You showed me there's another way. I want to help people, not just win cases. I want to have time for gardens and art classes and Sunday mornings. I want to build a life that would make people show up to my funeral and tell stories about how I made them feel." Amara was crying now, smiling through her tears. "What are you going to do for work?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." She stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you." This took real courage. "I'm terrified," David admitted into her shoulder. "Good. That means you're doing something that matters." 6 months later, David's life looked nothing like it had before. He'd taken a position at a small nonprofit law firm that specialized in helping elderly clients with estate planning, healthcare advocacy, and protecting them from financial exploitation. The office was in an older building with creaky floors and windows that didn't close quite right. His desk was secondhand. His salary was less than a quarter of what he'd been making, and he'd never been happier. David came home every evening at 6 o'clock. Actually came home. To the apartment he now shared with Amara. They'd moved in together 3 months ago, combining her colorful chaos with his organized minimalism. The result was a space that felt lived in and loved. Books everywhere. Plants on every surface. Photos on the walls from the community garden, from their weekend hiking trip, from the cooking class disaster where they'd burned everything. His work was different now, too. Instead of corporate mergers and high-stakes litigation, David spent his days helping people like Mrs. Rodriguez. He helped a veteran understand his benefits. He stopped a scam targeting seniors in a retirement community. He wrote wills for people who couldn't afford big firm prices. Every client became a person to him, not a case number. His old colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. When he ran into former co-workers, they looked at him with confusion and pity. Such a waste of potential, he overheard one say. But David didn't see it as a waste. He saw it as finally using his potential for something meaningful. The money situation was tighter, no question. David had sold his expensive car and bought a used one. He shopped at thrift stores now, something Amara had introduced him to, and discovered he actually enjoyed the treasure hunt aspect. They cooked at home most nights, trying new recipes and laughing at their failures. The things he'd thought he needed: expensive suits, fancy restaurants. The newest phone turned out to be easy to live without. His relationships changed too. He reconnected with his sister, actually spending time with her kids instead of just sending birthday checks. He made real friends at the community garden, people who knew him as David, not David Chen the lawyer. He volunteered at the community center twice a month, teaching a basic legal rights class to immigrants and refugees. His parents came around slowly. His mother still worried about his financial security. But when they visited and saw him cooking dinner with Amara, saw him talk enthusiastically about his work, helping an elderly woman keep her home, saw him smile more than he had in years, something softened in her eyes. "You look good, son," his father said quietly during that visit. "Healthy, happy." "I am, Dad. For the first time in a really long time, I actually am." One Sunday morning, David woke up early. Amara was still sleeping beside him, sunlight streaming through their bedroom window. He lay there, listening to the sounds of the city waking up, and took inventory of his life. His apartment was small. His bank account was modest. His job wasn't prestigious. By every measure his younger self would have used, he'd failed. But he thought about the client who'd hugged him last week, crying because he'd helped her navigate Medicare. He thought about the kid at the community center who wanted to be a lawyer now because David had talked to him about justice. He thought about the garden's tomato plants they'd harvested last week, turning them into sauce together with the other volunteers. He thought about Thursday movie nights with Amara, about lazy Saturday mornings, about having time to actually read books and take walks, and have conversations that went nowhere in particular. This was success. Not the version he'd been taught to chase, but something deeper and more real. Amara stirred beside him, opening her eyes. "You're thinking loud," she murmured. "I can hear it from here, just thinking about how different everything is. Good different or bad different." David pulled her closer. "The best different." Later that morning, they went to the community garden. It was becoming a tradition, their Sunday morning ritual. The garden had grown so much since that first day David had shown up, uncertain and out of place. Now he knew every plant, every volunteer, every corner of the space. He'd helped build the new raised beds. He'd painted the fence. He'd planted herbs and vegetables and flowers, watching them grow over months. Mrs. Kim brought homemade kimchi to share. Raphael showed them photos from his study abroad program. The father with his daughters gave them tomatoes from his plot. Everyone talked and laughed and worked together, creating something beautiful from empty dirt. "You know what I love about this place?" David said to Amara as they watered the herb garden together. "Nobody here cares what I used to do or how much money I used to make. They just care that I show up and pull weeds and help water plants. That's because this is real community," Amara said. "Not networking, not contacts, just people being present with each other." David's phone buzzed. A text from one of his old colleagues. "Just made partner. Big celebration tonight. You should have been here with us." Once, that message would have filled him with regret. Now he just felt grateful for the path he'd chosen instead. He looked around the garden, at the green growing things, at the people working together, at Amara beside him with dirt on her knees and happiness in her eyes. He thought about his small apartment filled with love, his meaningful work, his real friendships, his time and freedom and peace. Nothing else mattered. Not the partnership he'd turned down, not the money he wasn't making, not the prestige he'd walked away from. This right here, this moment, this life was everything he'd been searching for without knowing it. Amara hadn't walked into his life and saved him. She'd walked into his life and shown him that another way was possible. That success could be measured in connection instead of cash. That a life well lived wasn't about what you achieved, but about how you made people feel, how you showed up, how you loved. And David had chosen to build that life. Scary as it was, uncertain as it felt sometimes, he'd chosen the life that made him feel alive. That was the bravest thing he'd ever done. As they finished watering and packed up their things, Amara squeezed his hand. "Same time next week?" "Same time next week," David agreed. And every week after that, because this was his life now. Not perfect, but real. Not impressive on paper, but deeply fulfilling. Not what anyone expected, but exactly what he needed, and nothing else mattered.